Dr. Sarah Beth Crawford froze mid-step on the rocky riverbank, her binoculars slipping from trembling fingers as she stared at the impossible scene below. After 4 days of desperate searching for the missing Blake twins, she expected to find bodies, not two living infants nestled against the warm belly of a gray wolf. The she-wolf's amber eyes met hers with startling intelligence, as if asking for help rather than defending territory. Sarah's radio crackled to life as her shaking hand found the emergency channel. "Control, this is Dr. Crawford at Devil's Canyon. I need immediate medical evacuation." Her voice barely whispered the words that would change everything. "I have two infants, approximately 4 days old, and they're alive." The dispatcher's skeptical pause stretched like eternity. "Ma'am, are you certain those babies are still breathing?" Around her, the morning silence shattered as ravens exploded from nearby trees, as if nature itself recoiled from witnessing this miracle. Sarah's mind raced between scientific impossibility and undeniable reality. Two newborns had survived 4 nights in the Colorado wilderness because a wild animal had chosen love over instinct. What other secrets was this wolf hiding? And why did survival suddenly feel more terrifying than death? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, the mountain town of Riverside Falls had been divided by one controversial decision: the reintroduction of gray wolves to the Colorado wilderness. Dr. Sarah Beth Crawford had spent her entire career fighting for this moment, but at 52 she carried the weight of personal loss that made every victory bittersweet. Sarah's modest cabin overlooked the valley where she now tracked 17 wolves, each one representing hope for an ecosystem slowly healing from decades of imbalance. Her late son Michael would have been 28 this year. He'd dreamed of joining her research before an IED in Afghanistan stole that future. Now she poured her maternal instincts into protecting creatures most of the town feared. "They're not monsters," she'd tell anyone who'd listen. "They're mothers and fathers, just trying to survive." Across town, Margaret Rose Whitman understood that kind of loss intimately. The 55-year-old former pediatric nurse lived alone in a house that still echoed with memories of her daughter, Emily. 10 years had passed since the drunk driver took Emily's life, but Margaret still set 2 coffee cups each morning out of habit. Her neighbors whispered about the woman who talked to empty rooms and kept a nursery perfectly preserved. Margaret had opposed the wolf program initially, not from fear but from a deeper understanding that some wounds never fully heal. "Wild things belong in the wild," she'd argued at town meetings. "When you bring them into civilization, somebody always gets hurt." The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd become the very thing she'd warned against, a broken creature trying to exist in a world that had moved on without her. 20 miles away, in his glass mansion overlooking the Colorado River, Thomas Richardson Blake embodied everything his small-town neighbors resented about wealth. The 39-year-old tech mogul had built his fortune on algorithms that predicted human behavior, yet he couldn't decode the mystery of his own marriage falling apart. His wife, Rebecca, lay dying in their master bedroom, machines beeping steadily as she clung to life after complications from the twins' birth. The paternity test results hidden in his desk drawer felt like acid in his chest. 2 beautiful babies who might not even be his, born from a love that had turned to lies. "Promise me you'll love them," Rebecca whispered during her lucid moments. "Promise me, Tommy." But how could he promise to love children who represented his deepest betrayal? In the valley below, Luna, a 4-year-old gray wolf with unusual amber eyes, prowled the riverbank where she'd lost 3 litters to various tragedies. Neither she nor Tommy knew that their paths would soon intersect in the most impossible way, bound together by loss, love, and the fierce determination to protect the innocent. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who wouldn't meet Tommy's eyes. Inside, the DNA results confirmed his worst fears with clinical precision. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. The twins, sleeping peacefully in their nursery, carried another man's genetic code, a truth that shattered the last fragments of his already broken heart. Tommy's hands shook as he climbed the stairs to Rebecca's room, where machines monitored her failing vital signs. The woman he'd loved for 8 years lay pale against white sheets, her breathing shallow and labored. The complications from Charlotte and William's emergency delivery had triggered a cascade of organ failures that no amount of money could reverse. "Rebecca," he whispered, settling into the chair beside her bed. "We need to talk." Her eyes fluttered open, still beautiful despite the pain medication that clouded her thoughts. "Tommy, are the babies okay?" "They're fine." He pulled the papers from his jacket pocket, his voice barely controlled. "But I know the truth now, about their father." The color drained from Rebecca's face as recognition dawned. She'd been expecting this conversation, dreading it through every contraction, every moment of surgical complications that brought her closer to death. "Tommy, please." 8 years, he said, the words coming out like broken glass. 8 years of marriage. And you couldn't tell me you were seeing someone else? Couldn't tell me I was raising another man's children? Tears streamed down Rebecca's cheeks as she struggled to speak. It wasn't like that. It only happened once. When we were fighting about the fertility treatments, I was so angry, so lonely. Dr. Harrison was there, and Dr. Marcus Harrison? Tommy's voice turned cold. Your gynecologist. The man who's been treating us for infertility for 3 years? Rebecca's sob caught in her throat. I never meant for this to happen. When I found out I was pregnant, I hoped they were yours. The timing was so close and I wanted it to be true so badly. Tommy stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the Colorado River far below. The same river where his father had taught him to fish, where he'd proposed to Rebecca 5 years ago. Now it looked like a silver snake waiting to swallow everything he'd built. Do you love him? The question hung in the air between them. No, Rebecca whispered. It was a mistake, Tommy. The biggest mistake of my life. I love you. I've always loved you, but not enough to be faithful. Please don't do this. Not now, when I'm... She couldn't finish the sentence, but they both knew she was dying. The monitors continued their steady beeping, counting down the final hours of a life that had been built on a lie. Tommy returned to her bedside, his face a mask of controlled rage and devastating hurt. Those babies downstairs, they're innocent in all this. But every time I look at them, all I'll see is your betrayal. How am I supposed to love children who remind me that my wife was sleeping with another man? Because they need you, Rebecca gasped, her strength fading. Because love isn't about DNA, it's about choice. Please, Tommy, promise me you'll choose to love them. But Tommy couldn't promise that. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too complete. He sat in silence as Rebecca's breathing grew more labored, as the machines began to sound alarms that brought nurses rushing into the room. He watched his wife die without giving her the absolution she craved, without promising to care for children who weren't his. 3 days after Rebecca's funeral, Tommy found himself driving toward the Cascade Bridge with Charlotte and William sleeping in their car seats behind him. The babies had cried constantly since their mother's death, refusing bottles, rejecting comfort from anyone who tried to help. Their wails echoed through the mansion like accusations, like reminders of everything he'd lost. I can't do this, he told them as he parked near the bridge's center. I can't look at you every day and remember what she did to us. The Colorado River rushed 40 feet below, swollen with spring snowmelt that would carry away any evidence of his final decision. Tommy lifted Charlotte first, her tiny face scrunched with confusion as cold air hit her skin. Then William, so small and fragile in his arms. "Your mother made this choice when she betrayed our family," he whispered to them. "I'm just finishing what she started." From the riverbank below, Luna watched the strange scene unfold with growing agitation. The wolf's keen senses detected the human's distress, the sharp scent of grief and rage that preceded violence. When Tommy stepped to the bridge's edge, Luna began to pace, an inexplicable urgency driving her toward the water she normally avoided. The splash echoed across the canyon as Tommy released the twins into the rushing current below. Luna's powerful legs propelled her down the steep riverbank as the two small bundles hit the water with sickening splashes. Every instinct screamed at her to flee. Wolves avoided deep water, especially the treacherous currents of the Colorado River during spring runoff. But something deeper than instinct drove her forward, a maternal pull she couldn't resist as the infant's cries pierced the canyon air. The icy water shocked her system as she plunged in, her thick coat immediately waterlogged and heavy. The current grabbed at her, trying to sweep her downstream, but Luna fought against it with desperate strength. Charlotte had gone under first, her tiny form disappearing beneath the churning surface. Luna dove deep, her amber eyes scanning the murky depths until she spotted the flash of pink blanket tumbling along the rocky bottom. Her powerful jaws clamped gently around the infant's clothing, careful not to pierce the delicate skin as she fought her way back to the surface. Charlotte wasn't breathing, her lips already turning blue from the cold water. Luna had seen enough death in the wild to recognize the signs, but maternal instinct drove her to try something she'd never done before. She began pressing her snout against the baby's chest, mimicking the life-giving compressions she'd witnessed during her own difficult births. Water spilled from Charlotte's tiny mouth as Luna worked frantically, and suddenly the infant gasped, coughing up river water and beginning to cry. A sound that meant life, that meant hope, but there was no time to celebrate. William was still somewhere in the deadly current, and every second decreased his chances of survival. Luna spotted him 50 yards downstream, his white blanket caught momentarily on a fallen log before the current tore him free again. She swam harder than she'd ever swum in her life, her heart pounding as she watched the second infant disappear around a bend in the river. When she finally reached him, William wasn't moving. His small body floated face down, limp and lifeless in her jaws as she dragged him to a small sandbar hidden behind a cluster of boulders. The wolf's emergency training kicked in, not from any human instruction, but from the ancient wisdom embedded in her DNA. She worked on William for what felt like hours, pressing and releasing, breathing her warm breath over his cold face. Just when despair began to creep in, the baby coughed violently, expelling what seemed like half the river from his tiny lungs. Both infants were alive, but Luna's ordeal was just beginning. They were hypothermic, hungry, and completely dependent on a creature who had no idea how to care for human young. The sandbar provided temporary shelter, but Luna knew she needed to find something better, somewhere warm, dry, and hidden from the search parties that would inevitably come looking. Working through the night, Luna began constructing what could only be described as a nursery. Using her powerful claws and teeth, she dragged driftwood and river stones to create a makeshift shelter against the canyon wall. She lined it with fur she pulled from her own coat, creating a warm nest that would protect the babies from the elements. The process left her bleeding and exhausted, but the infant's survival depended on it. By dawn of the second day, Sheriff Jim Bradley had organized the largest search and rescue operation in Riverside Falls history. Helicopters circled overhead while teams of volunteers combed every inch of the riverbank downstream from the bridge. Tommy's abandoned car and suicide note had told them exactly what had happened, but nobody wanted to accept that two innocent babies had been murdered by their own father. Margaret Rose Whitman joined the search despite her usual reluctance to be around crowds. Something about the missing twins had awakened a maternal instinct she thought had died with Emily. She found herself walking the riverbank for hours, calling out names that meant nothing to her but somehow felt important. "Charlotte! William!" "We're not going to find them alive," muttered Deputy Carson, his voice heavy with resignation. "Not after this long in that water." "Don't say that," Margaret snapped, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. "Don't you dare give up on those babies." Meanwhile, Sarah Beth Crawford was tracking Luna's GPS collar and growing increasingly puzzled by the data. For 48 hours, the wolf had remained in one small area near the river, behavior completely outside normal patterns. Wolves were nomadic by nature, constantly moving through their territory in search of food and mates. But Luna hadn't moved more than 100 yards in 2 days. "That's not right," Sarah muttered, staring at her computer screen in the makeshift command center. "She should be hunting, patrolling her territory. Why would she stay in one spot for so long?" Her research assistant, a young graduate student named David, looked over her shoulder. "Maybe she's injured or protecting a kill?" "No," Sarah said slowly, a wild idea beginning to form in her mind. "She's protecting something else." On the third day, Luna's own survival began to fail. She hadn't eaten since before the rescue, and her body was burning through its reserves trying to keep the babies warm and fed. Through trial and error, she had discovered that she could provide them with some nutrition, her own milk, triggered by the stress response of caring for helpless young. But it wasn't enough, and she knew it. The babies cried constantly now, weak and dehydrated despite her best efforts. Luna's amber eyes reflected an intelligence that seemed almost human as she made a decision that went against every survival instinct she possessed. She began howling, long, mournful calls that echoed through the canyon and could be heard for miles. Sarah Beth Crawford was the first to hear Luna's distress calls echoing across the valley. Something in those howls was different. Not the territorial marking or pack communication she'd studied for years, but something desperate, pleading. Against protocol and common sense, she grabbed her field equipment and headed toward the sound, driven by a scientist's curiosity and a mother's intuition that something extraordinary was happening in those red rock canyons. The discovery that awaited her would challenge everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between species, about the nature of love itself. The medical helicopter's rotors kicked up clouds of red dust as paramedics worked frantically over Charlotte and William Blake on the canyon floor. Dr. Amanda Chen, the pediatric specialist rushed in from Denver Children's Hospital, couldn't hide her amazement as she examined the twins who should have been dead 3 times over. "Their core body temperature is low but stable," she announced to the gathering crowd of rescuers and reporters. "Mild dehydration, but nothing life-threatening. I don't understand how this is possible." Sarah Beth Crawford stood protectively near Luna, who had retreated to a respectful distance but refused to leave entirely. The wolf's amber eyes never left the babies as medical personnel prepared them for transport. When Charlotte began crying inconsolably during the IV insertion, Luna let out a soft whimper that seemed to calm the infant immediately. "Did you see that?" whispered Channel 7 reporter Jessica Martinez to her cameraman. "That wolf actually responded to the baby's distress." The crowd of onlookers had grown throughout the afternoon as news of the impossible rescue spread through Riverside Falls and beyond. Some watched in amazement, others in fear. Betty Morrison, a local rancher whose livestock had been threatened by the wolf reintroduction, pushed through the gathered people with obvious agitation. "That animal needs to be destroyed," she declared loudly. "Any wolf that's lost its natural fear of humans is dangerous. Today it might save babies, But tomorrow, it could attack them. Are you insane? Margaret Rose Whitman had arrived with the second wave of searchers, and her voice cut through the crowd like a blade. That wolf just performed a miracle, and you want to kill her for it? Margaret hadn't intended to speak up, but something about Betty's callousness triggered a protective rage she hadn't felt since Emily's death. She found herself stepping forward, facing down the larger woman with surprising courage. "My livestock matter too," Betty shot back, "and any predator that's been around human babies this long has been compromised. It's basic wildlife management." Dr. Chen looked up from her examination, her face grave. "I need to tell you all something that's going to be very difficult to believe." She paused, glancing around at the assembled crowd. "These babies have been receiving nutrition. Specifically, they show clear evidence of having been fed milk within the last 24 hours. Sheriff Bradley frowned. "What kind of milk? Formula?" "No," Dr. Chen replied slowly. "Based on the preliminary analysis, it appears to be canine milk, which should be impossible since dogs can't nurse human infants. The digestive systems are completely incompatible." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Sarah felt her scientific worldview tilting as she watched Luna pace anxiously near the medical team. Everything she'd studied about interspecies behavior said this was impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued. "The babies show signs of deliberate care. Their clothing has been repositioned to provide better insulation. Someone, or something, has been actively working to keep them alive." Margaret stepped closer to Luna, ignoring the gasps from the crowd. The wolf didn't retreat or show aggression. Instead, she sat down and tilted her head, studying Margaret with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "I've seen that look before," Margaret said softly, more to herself than to the others. "Years ago, when I worked at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, we had an injured wolf shot by poachers. She had the same amber eyes, the same scar on her left ear." Sarah's breath caught. "You worked with wolves?" "Just one," Margaret replied, her voice growing stronger as memories surfaced. "A young female, badly wounded. I was the night nurse who helped rehabilitate her before release. She was so intelligent, so aware. We called her Luna because she only seemed peaceful during the full moon." Luna's ears perked up at the name, and she took a tentative step toward Margaret. The crowd tensed, but Margaret held her ground, extending her hand slowly. Luna sniffed carefully, then pressed her snout into Margaret's palm with unmistakable recognition. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's really you." The reunion between woman and wolf created a media sensation that spread far beyond the small Colorado town. By evening, news vans lined the road to the hospital where Charlotte and William were undergoing extensive medical evaluation. The footage of Luna recognizing Margaret played on every major network, sparking fierce debates about animal consciousness and the ethics of wildlife management. Inside the hospital, Tommy Blake's sister Jennifer had arrived from California, demanding immediate custody of the twins. The 35-year-old corporate lawyer made it clear that she viewed the entire situation as an embarrassing spectacle that needed to be contained quickly. "These children need stability, not to be turned into some kind of circus act," Jennifer announced to the hospital administrator. "I'm their legal guardian now, and I want them transferred to a private facility in Los Angeles immediately." But Margaret Rose Whitman had other plans. She spent that night completing emergency foster care paperwork, working with a determination that surprised even herself. At 55, she had never expected to be a mother again, but holding Charlotte briefly in the hospital had awakened something she thought had died with Emily. "I don't understand," said Carol Stevens, the social worker assigned to the case. "You're single, approaching retirement age, and you have no experience with twins. Why do you want to take this on? Margaret looked through the hospital window toward the parking lot where Sarah kept vigil near Luna, who refused to leave the area. Because sometimes life gives you a second chance you never thought you'd get. Those babies survived because someone loved them enough to sacrifice everything. I want to be worthy of that love. The scientific community was less sentimental. Dr. Robert Jameson, a renowned animal behaviorist from Stanford, arrived with a team of researchers intent on debunking what he called anthropomorphic hysteria. What we're seeing here is instinctual behavior being misinterpreted through an emotional lens, he explained to a packed press conference. Wolves have been known to adopt orphaned pups from other packs. This is simply an extension of that behavior, not evidence of some mystical interspecies bond. But Sarah's preliminary findings challenged every conventional explanation. Trail cameras positioned throughout Luna's territory had captured the full scope of her rescue and care activities. The footage showed Luna traveling over 15 miles round trip to bring fresh water to the babies, hunting and processing food specifically for their nutritional needs, and maintaining a complex den structure that demonstrated remarkable problem-solving abilities. Dr. Jameson is entitled to his opinion, Sarah told the gathered reporters, her professional reputation on the line. But the evidence suggests we're witnessing cognitive abilities and emotional responses that science has previously believed impossible in wild animals. The controversy deepened when veterinarian Dr. Michael Torres revealed the full extent of Luna's sacrifice. Blood work showed that the wolf had pushed her body to the brink of starvation, burning through fat reserves and muscle mass to maintain milk production for the human infants. She gave everything she had to keep them alive, Dr. Torres explained. In the wild, this level of self-sacrifice is typically only seen in mothers caring for their own offspring. The fact that she did this for human babies challenges our fundamental understanding of animal behavior. Meanwhile, the custody battle intensified. Jennifer Blake had hired a team of lawyers arguing that Margaret was emotionally unstable and motivated by misplaced grief rather than genuine care for the children. The fact that Margaret insisted on regular visits to Luna was presented as evidence of poor judgment. My clients want what's best for Charlotte and William, Jennifer's attorney stated. That means a stable home environment, excellent schools, and freedom from the media circus that seems to follow Miss Whitman wherever she goes. But Margaret had an unexpected ally in Judge Patricia Winters, a 60-year-old jurist who had presided over family court for 20 years. Judge Winters had lost her own daughter in a climbing accident and recognized the authentic grief and love in Margaret's testimony. Ms. Blake, the judge said during a preliminary hearing, I understand your concerns about stability and normalcy, but these children have already experienced something far from normal. They were saved by extraordinary love, and perhaps they need a guardian who understands the value of that gift. The hearing was interrupted by commotion outside the courthouse. Luna had somehow escaped from the temporary holding area Sarah had constructed and was pacing the courthouse steps. She seemed agitated, almost frantic, as if sensing that important decisions about her babies were being made inside. Animal control officers tried to approach with tranquilizer guns, but Luna's distress only increased. She began howling, long, mournful calls that could be heard throughout the building. Inside the courtroom, Charlotte and William, who had been sleeping peacefully, suddenly began crying inconsolably. Your Honor, Margaret said, rising from her seat, may I suggest that the children be brought where Luna can see them? I believe she's calling for them. Judge Winters looked skeptical, but the baby's continued distress was disrupting the entire proceeding. Against all protocol and safety guidelines, she agreed to a brief recess during which Charlotte and William were brought to the courthouse window. The moment Luna saw the babies, her howling stopped. She sat down on the courthouse steps and watched them with intense concentration. The twins, who had been crying steadily, immediately calmed and began making soft, cooing sounds toward the window. The crowd that had gathered to witness the custody hearing stood in stunned silence as woman, wolf, and babies seemed to communicate across the glass barrier. Even Jennifer Blake appeared moved by the obvious bond between Luna and the children she had saved. Dr. Chen, who had been observing the children's medical progress, spoke quietly to Judge Winters. "Your Honor, I have to report that these babies have been thriving in ways that are medically unusual. Their development markers are actually ahead of schedule, and they show signs of unusual emotional stability for infants who have experienced severe trauma." "What are you suggesting, Doctor?" "I'm suggesting that their exposure to Luna may have provided them with something beyond basic survival. There's emerging research about the therapeutic benefits of animal interaction for trauma victims. These children seem to have formed a bond that may be crucial to their psychological development." The judge looked from the babies to Luna to Margaret, weighing impossible factors in an unprecedented case. "Ms. Whitman, if I were to grant you temporary custody, would you commit to allowing the children ongoing contact with this wolf?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Your Honor, I believe Luna is as much their mother as I hope to be." "Yes, I would commit to that relationship." Outside the courthouse, Sarah Beth Crawford was fighting her own battle to protect Luna from those who saw her unusual behavior as dangerous rather than miraculous. The state wildlife department wanted her relocated to a facility hundreds of miles away, effectively ending any possibility of continued contact with the children. "We can't set a precedent that allows wild animals to become attached to humans," explained Department Director Robert Hayes. "It's dangerous for both species." But Sarah had spent the last week documenting something unprecedented in wolf research. Luna wasn't just displaying maternal behavior toward human infants. She was demonstrating cognitive abilities that suggested a level of consciousness science was only beginning to understand. The battle lines were drawn between those who saw Luna as a dangerous anomaly and those who recognized her as something extraordinary. The final decision would determine not just the fate of one wolf and two babies, but the future of human understanding about the emotional lives of wild animals. As the sun set over Riverside Falls, Margaret Rose Whitman prepared for the fight of her life, not just for the right to raise Charlotte and William, but for the preservation of the miraculous bond that had already saved their lives once. The courthouse steps had become a battlefield of public opinion as hundreds of protesters gathered for what the media dubbed the trial of the century. On one side, supporters held signs reading, "Luna saves lives" and "Wolves are family too." On the other, ranchers and wildlife management advocates countered with, "Wild animals belong in the wild" and "Safety first." The division ran deeper than anyone had anticipated, splitting families and friendships throughout Riverside Falls. Judge Patricia Winters called the packed courtroom to order as television cameras rolled from the back row. This custody hearing had evolved into something unprecedented, a legal proceeding that would determine not just the fate of two orphaned babies, but the rights of the wolf who had saved them. Margaret Rose Whitman sat at the petitioner's table, her hands clasped tightly as she watched Charlotte and William sleep peacefully in their carriers beside her. At 55, she had never imagined herself fighting for anything this important. The last decade of her life had been a quiet descent into grief and isolation. Now, looking at these babies who had somehow awakened her maternal instincts, she felt more alive than she had since Emily's death. "Your Honor," began Jennifer Blake's attorney, Richard Thornton, "we appreciate the extraordinary circumstances surrounding these children's rescue. However, my client respectfully submits that emotion cannot override practical considerations. Miss Whitman is a single woman of advanced maternal age with no recent childcare experience. She has admittedly struggled with depression following her daughter's death 10 years ago. Most concerning, she insists on maintaining contact with a wild predator, which any reasonable person would consider a safety risk." Thornton clicked through a PowerPoint presentation showing statistics about wolf attacks, single-parent adoption failures, and the challenges of raising twins. His case was methodical, logical, and devastating to Margaret's hopes. Furthermore, he continued, my client, Jennifer Blake, is a successful attorney with substantial financial resources. She can provide these children with the best education, health care, and opportunities. She has a stable marriage and lives in a community with excellent schools and no dangerous wildlife. Jennifer Blake nodded approvingly from the gallery, her designer suit and confident posture contrasting sharply with Margaret's simple dress and nervous energy. She had flown in from Los Angeles with character witnesses, financial statements, and a comprehensive child care plan that addressed every possible concern except one: love. When Margaret's court-appointed attorney, David Martinez, rose to present her case, he seemed overwhelmed by the task ahead. A recent law school graduate doing pro bono work, he lacked the polish and resources of his opponent. Your Honor, David began uncertainly, my client may not have the financial advantages of Miss Blake, but she offers something that money can't buy: a genuine understanding of what these children have endured and a commitment to honoring the extraordinary bond that saved their lives. He called Margaret to the witness stand, where she faced the most important testimony of her life. Under questioning, she revealed the depths of her grief following Emily's death, her years of therapy, and her gradual healing through volunteer work at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, where she had first met Luna. Tell the court about your relationship with the wolf, David prompted. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she shared the memory. Luna came to us badly wounded, shot by poachers who had killed her pack. She was pregnant at the time and lost her litter due to the trauma. I worked the night shifts, and she seemed to trust me more than the day staff. There was something special about her intelligence, her awareness. When we released her back to the wild, I thought I'd never see her again. And now? Now I understand that some bonds transcend species. Luna chose to save Charlotte and William when their own father abandoned them. She gave everything she had to keep them alive. If I'm fortunate enough to raise these children, I want them to understand that gift. I want them to know that love comes in many forms, and sometimes the most profound love comes from the most unexpected sources. Margaret's testimony was interrupted by a commotion outside. Luna had appeared on the courthouse lawn, despite animal control's efforts to keep her contained. Through the windows, the court could see her pacing restlessly, occasionally letting out soft whimpers that seemed directed toward the building where her babies were being discussed. Jennifer Blake stood up abruptly. Your Honor, this proves my point exactly. That animal has become dangerously fixated on these children. What happens when she decides to reclaim them? What happens when she sees them with other people and perceives them as threats? But Dr. Sarah Beth Crawford, who had been observing from the gallery, requested permission to address the court. Your Honor, I've been studying Luna for over 2 years. What we're witnessing isn't dangerous fixation. It's maternal concern. She's not trying to reclaim the babies. She's ensuring their safety. In the wild, wolf mothers often allow other pack members to help care for their young. Luna appears to view Ms. Whitman as a trusted member of her extended pack. Judge Winters looked skeptical. Dr. Crawford, you're asking this court to base a custody decision on your interpretation of animal behavior. How can we be certain of a wild animal's intentions? Because of this, Your Honor. Sarah produced a manila folder filled with photographs and research data. Trail cameras have been recording Luna's behavior since the rescue. She's been hunting and bringing food to the area near Mispa Whitman's house, behavior consistent with a wolf providing for extended family. She's also been patrolling the perimeter, but not aggressively. She's protecting, not threatening. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. as people processed this information. Outside, Luna's pacing had attracted a growing crowd of onlookers, some supportive, others fearful. News helicopters circled overhead, while reporters provided live updates to a national audience captivated by the unprecedented case. Dr. Amanda Chen requested permission to testify about the baby's medical condition. Your Honor, I've been monitoring Charlotte and William's development since their rescue. Despite the trauma they experienced, they're thriving in ways that are medically remarkable. Their stress indicators are lower than normal for infants who have experienced separation from their birth parents. I believe their ongoing exposure to Luna may be providing therapeutic benefits we don't fully understand. Are you recommending that contact with a wild animal continue? Judge Winters asked. I'm saying that severing the bond that already exists might cause more psychological harm than maintaining it under controlled circumstances. These children have been through extraordinary trauma. The fact that they're developing normally suggests that their current care arrangement is working. Jennifer Blake's attorney objected vigorously. Your Honor, we're talking about wild predators here, not therapy dogs. The defendant wants to raise these children in proximity to an animal that could kill them without warning. This isn't progressive thinking. It's reckless endangerment. But Margaret's supporters in the gallery had been growing throughout the testimony. Townspeople who had watched her quiet suffering for years, who had seen her gradual healing through her work with animals, began speaking up during the public comment period. Margaret Whitman has been helping injured wildlife for 10 years, said veterinarian Dr. Michael Torres. She's never had an incident, never shown poor judgment. If anyone can maintain a safe relationship between these children and Luna, it's her. Betty Morrison, the rancher who had initially called for Luna's destruction, surprised everyone by standing up. I still think wild animals are dangerous, Your Honor, but I've been watching that wolf for the past week and I've never seen anything like it. She's not acting like a predator, she's acting like a grandmother. The comment drew nervous laughter from the gallery, but also nods of agreement. Several people had observed Luna's behavior and reached the same conclusion. As testimony continued into the afternoon, a pattern emerged that no one had anticipated. The case was becoming less about custody law and more about the fundamental question of what constitutes a family. Multiple witnesses testified about the obvious bond between Margaret, the babies, and Luna, a relationship that defied conventional understanding but seemed to be working. Child psychologist Dr. Rebecca Martinez testified via video link from Denver. Your Honor, I've reviewed the case materials and the medical reports. While the circumstances are highly unusual, the children appear to be receiving excellent care. Attachment theory suggests that children benefit from multiple caring relationships. If the relationship with Luna is providing stability rather than stress, it may actually be beneficial to their development. The turning point came when Luna herself seemed to sense the gravity of the proceedings. She approached the courthouse windows and lay down where the babies could see her, remaining perfectly still except for the gentle movement of her breathing. Charlotte and William, who had been fussy throughout much of the hearing, immediately calmed and reached toward the window where Luna waited. Your Honor, Margaret said softly, I know this situation is unprecedented. I know it seems risky and unconventional. But sometimes life doesn't follow the rules we expect. These babies survive because love transcended every boundary we thought existed. If you give me the chance, I promise to honor that gift. I promise to raise them with the same fierce protectiveness that Luna showed when she risked everything to save them. Judge Winters called for a recess, during which she reviewed case law, medical reports, and child welfare guidelines. Outside, the crowd continued to grow as news of the hearing spread across social media. The hashtag #LunasFamily was trending worldwide, with people sharing their own stories of unexpected bonds with animals. When court reconvened, Judge Winters addressed the packed courtroom with a gravity that silenced even the reporters. In 30 years on the bench, I have never encountered a case that challenges so many assumptions about family, love, and the bonds that define us as human beings. The law requires me to consider the best interests of Charlotte and William Blake, but it doesn't provide clear guidance for circumstances this extraordinary. She paused, looking from Margaret to Jennifer to the babies sleeping peacefully in their carriers. However, I am struck by one indisputable fact. These children are alive because of love that defied every natural law. They are thriving under the care of a woman who understands the value of that sacrifice. While the situation is unconventional, there is no evidence that it poses a danger to the children's welfare. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Winters reached her decision, one that would not only determine the fate of two orphaned babies, but set a precedent that would be debated for generations to come. Judge Winters cleared her throat, the weight of her decision visible in every line of her weathered face. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, this court awards temporary custody of Charlotte and William Blake to Margaret Rose Whitman, subject to monthly evaluations by Child Protective Services and ongoing medical monitoring by Dr. Amanda Chen. The courtroom erupted in cheers from Margaret's supporters, but the celebration was short-lived. Jennifer Blake shot to her feet, her face flushed with anger and disbelief. "Your Honor, this is unconscionable," she shouted above the noise. "You're placing two innocent children in the care of a mentally unstable woman and a wild predator. I will appeal this decision immediately, and I will file for emergency custody with the federal court if necessary." Judge Winters banged her gavel repeatedly, struggling to restore order. "Ms. Blake, you have every right to appeal, but until that process is completed, my ruling stands. However," she continued, her voice growing stern, "there are strict conditions attached to this custody arrangement." The conditions were extensive and non-negotiable. Margaret would be required to undergo monthly psychological evaluations, maintain a residence at least half a mile from Luna's territory, and ensure that any contact between the children and the wolf occurred only under the supervision of Dr. Sarah Beth Crawford or other qualified wildlife experts. Most critically, if Luna showed any signs of aggressive behavior toward the children or anyone else, the custody arrangement would be immediately terminated. Margaret nodded eagerly to each condition, but privately, she wondered how she could maintain the bond that had saved Charlotte and William's lives while keeping them at a distance that satisfied the court's safety concerns. The half-mile restriction seemed particularly cruel, given that Luna had been patrolling the area around Margaret's house since the rescue. As the court session ended, Margaret finally allowed herself to hold the babies she had fought so hard to protect. Charlotte gazed up at her with eyes that seemed impossibly wise for an infant, while William gripped her finger with surprising strength. The moment felt sacred, like a promise being made and accepted. "We're going home," she whispered to them, tears streaming down her face. "All of us." But outside the courthouse, the celebration turned ugly quickly. Jennifer Blake faced a crowd of reporters, her composure cracking under the pressure of her unexpected defeat. "This judge has prioritized public sentiment over child welfare," she declared. "Two innocent babies are being used as props in some misguided fantasy about interspecies bonding. When something terrible happens, and it will happen, remember that this court had the chance to prevent it." Her words struck fear into many of the onlookers who had been swept up in the emotional appeal of Margaret and Luna's story. Betty Morrison, despite her earlier supportive testimony, approached Margaret with obvious concern. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said quietly. "That wolf may have saved those babies once, but wild animals are unpredictable. One bad day, one moment when she sees them as threats instead of family, and everything could change." Margaret clutched the babies closer, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had won the legal battle, but the real challenge was just beginning. How could she honor Luna's sacrifice while keeping Charlotte and William safe? How could she maintain the bond that had saved their lives without exposing them to the very real dangers of wild animal contact? Doctor. Sarah Beth Crawford approached with a solution that seemed both ingenious and heartbreaking. "I've been thinking about the court's restrictions," she said. "What if we create a viewing area near your property? A place where Luna can see the children and they can see her, but with a barrier that ensures safety." Margaret's heart sank at the suggestion. The idea of keeping Luna behind glass or fencing felt like a betrayal of everything the wolf had done for them. But she also understood the reality of their situation. Any accident, any perceived threat, would result in the children being taken away and Luna potentially being destroyed. "It's not ideal," Sarah continued, reading the disappointment in Margaret's eyes, "but it might be the only way to preserve their relationship while satisfying the court's safety requirements." The first few weeks of custody were a constant battle against doubt and criticism. Margaret moved into a small house on the outskirts of Riverside Falls, carefully measured to be exactly half a mile from Luna's primary territory. The house felt empty and isolated, especially during the long nights when Charlotte and William cried inconsolably, seemingly calling for the wolf mother who had first comforted them. Luna's behavior during this separation was equally distressing. The wolf paced the boundary line between her territory and Margaret's property, occasionally letting out mournful howls that could be heard throughout the valley. Local residents complained about the noise, and animal control officers made several attempts to drive Luna further into the wilderness, but she always returned to her vigil. The monthly evaluations became exercises in walking a tightrope between honesty and self-preservation. Margaret couldn't admit how much she struggled with the twins' nighttime crying fits, how they seemed to calm only when she played recordings of wolf howls on her phone. She couldn't mention the dreams she had of Luna searching frantically for the babies, or the way Charlotte and William turned their heads toward any sound that resembled a wolf's call. Doctor. Amanda Chen's medical reports documented the children's declining emotional state. Their sleep patterns were disrupted, their feeding was irregular, and they showed signs of anxiety unusual for infants their age. When Chen suggested that the separation from Luna might be causing psychological distress, Child Protective Services worker Janet Reynolds grew concerned. "Ms. Whitman," Janet said during a surprise visit, "these children seem to be regressing rather than improving. Their development markers are falling behind where they were immediately after the rescue." "Can you explain why that might be happening?" Margaret struggled to find words that wouldn't jeopardize her custody. "They've been through tremendous trauma," she said carefully. "Maybe they just need more time to adjust to their new environment." But privately, Margaret knew the truth. Charlotte and William were grieving for Luna just as much as they had once grieved for their biological parents. The wolf had been their first source of comfort and security, and the forced separation was causing them genuine distress. The crisis came during the 4th week of custody. Charlotte developed a fever that wouldn't break despite medication and medical attention. She cried constantly, refusing to eat or sleep, her tiny body burning with an illness that Dr. Chen couldn't definitively diagnose. "I want to admit her to the hospital for observation," Dr. Chen told Margaret. "Her white blood cell count is elevated, suggesting some kind of infection, but we can't identify the source." Margaret sat in the pediatric ward watching Charlotte suffer, feeling helpless and desperate. William, though not physically ill, had become listless and unresponsive, as if his twins' distress was affecting him psychologically. The babies who had thrived under Luna's care were now failing under Margaret's protection. On the 5th night of Charlotte's hospitalization, Margaret made a decision that could cost her everything. She bundled William in warm blankets and drove to the boundary line between her property and Luna's territory. The wolf appeared within minutes, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "I don't know what to do," Margaret whispered across the distance that separated them. "They're sick, and I think they're calling for you." Luna approached as close as she dared, whimpering softly as she caught William's scent on the wind. The baby, who had been crying weakly throughout the drive, suddenly became alert, reaching toward the wolf with tiny hands that seemed to recognize their first protector. Margaret made a choice that defied court orders, safety protocols, and common sense. She placed William on the ground between herself and Luna, close enough for the wolf to reach him but ready to intervene if necessary. What happened next would become the subject of heated debate for years to come. Luna approached slowly, carefully, and began licking William's face and hands with the same gentle attention she had shown during those first desperate days of rescue. The baby's crying stopped immediately, replaced by soft cooing sounds of contentment. Within hours, William's color had improved and his appetite returned. More remarkably, Charlotte's fever broke that same night, even though she was miles away in the hospital. The medical staff couldn't explain the sudden improvement, but Margaret understood. The twins' bond with Luna transcended physical proximity. The unauthorized contact could have ended Margaret's custody immediately, but she knew she had discovered something the court system couldn't understand. Charlotte and William weren't just physically dependent on human care, they were emotionally bonded to the wolf who had first saved them. Severing that connection completely wasn't protecting them. It was slowly killing them. Margaret drove home that night, knowing she faced an impossible choice: follow the court's restrictions and watch the children she loved slowly deteriorate, or find a way to honor their need for Luna while keeping everyone safe. The answer would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed, and a willingness to risk everything she had fought so hard to gain. The phone call that changed everything came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Margaret had been awarded custody. Dr. Amanda Chen's voice was strained as she delivered news that would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about Tommy Blake's motivations. "Margaret, I need you to come to the hospital immediately. We've received some information about the twins' paternity that changes everything we believed about this case." Margaret arrived at Denver Children's Hospital to find Dr. Chen waiting with Sheriff Bradley, and a man she didn't recognize. A tall, distinguished gentleman in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Harrison, Rebecca Blake's former gynecologist. "Ms. Whitman," Dr. Harrison began, his voice heavy with guilt, "I need to tell you something that I should have revealed weeks ago. The paternity test that drove Tommy Blake to throw those babies into the river, it was falsified." Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "What do you mean, falsified?" "Tommy Blake had many business enemies," Sheriff Bradley explained, consulting his notes. "One of them, a rival tech executive named David Sterling, had been trying to destroy Tommy's marriage for months. Sterling hired a private investigator to break into Dr. Harrison's office and alter the DNA test results." Dr. Harrison's face was etched with remorse as he continued the story. "Rebecca Blake never had an affair. She was completely faithful to her husband throughout their marriage. The babies Tommy threw into that river were his own biological children. Charlotte and William are true Blake heirs." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She thought of Tommy's final moments on that bridge, convinced he was disposing of evidence of his wife's betrayal, when in reality he was murdering his own flesh and blood based on a lie orchestrated by a business rival. "Sterling wanted to drive Tommy to financial ruin and personal destruction," Sheriff Bradley continued. "He succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. Tommy killed himself believing his wife had betrayed him, never knowing that the children he threw away were the family he'd always wanted." Margaret sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the tragic irony. "Does Jennifer Blake know? We told her an hour ago. Dr. Chen replied. "She's flying back from Los Angeles immediately. She's demanding emergency custody based on the new information, claiming that the children's true parentage changes the legal situation entirely." But there was more devastating news to come. Dr. Harrison revealed that Sterling's scheme had gone far deeper than anyone realized. The private investigator he'd hired had also been responsible for tampering with Rebecca's medical records, creating false evidence of fertility issues that had tormented the couple for years. "Rebecca and Tommy could have had children naturally," Dr. Harrison explained, his voice breaking. "The fertility problems that led them to my clinic were entirely fabricated. Sterling wanted to ensure that any children Rebecca eventually had would be questioned, creating doubt and suspicion that would destroy their marriage. The cruelty of the deception was staggering. Rebecca had undergone years of painful fertility treatments based on false medical information, while Tommy had lived with the manufactured doubt about his ability to father children. When Rebecca finally became pregnant naturally, as she could have all along, the falsified paternity test convinced Tommy that the children couldn't possibly be his. "There's something else," Sheriff Bradley said grimly. "We found Sterling this morning. Apparent suicide in his Denver penthouse. He left a full confession detailing the entire scheme, but it's too late to bring him to justice." Margaret thought of Tommy's final moments, the anguish he must have felt believing his wife had betrayed him with another man. The truth that Sterling was the real betrayer, that Rebecca had been innocent and the babies were Tommy's own children, had died with both men, leaving behind only devastation and orphaned innocence. "What does this mean for custody?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "It means that Jennifer Blake has a much stronger legal claim," Dr. Chen admitted. "She's not just Tommy's sister anymore. She's the biological aunt of children who were murdered by their own father based on a lie. The courts will have to consider whether blood relation takes precedence over the bonds you've formed." The media explosion that followed Sterling's posthumous confession was unlike anything Riverside Falls had ever experienced. The story had every element that captivated public attention: corporate conspiracy, tragic misunderstanding, innocent children, and the wolf who had saved them from a father's misguided rage. Jennifer Blake arrived in Colorado with a new team of attorneys and a dramatically different approach. Gone was her cold corporate demeanor, replaced by genuine grief for her brother's tragic mistake and determination to honor his memory by caring for his biological children. "I never understood how my brother could have done something so monstrous," she told reporters outside the courthouse. "Now I know he was manipulated by a man who wanted to destroy our family." Tommy died believing a lie, but these children will grow up knowing the truth about their parents' love. Margaret watched the press conference from her living room, holding Charlotte and William close as her world crumbled around her. The babies had been thriving under her care, especially since she'd begun allowing carefully supervised contact with Luna despite court restrictions. But blood relation was a powerful force in custody law, and Jennifer's claim would be nearly impossible to overcome. The revelation about the twins' true parentage also changed public perception of their story. What had once been seen as a tale of redemption, orphaned children saved by a wolf and raised by a grieving woman, now became a tragedy of corporate greed and family destruction. The focus shifted from Margaret's fitness as a guardian to Jennifer's right to raise her brother's children. Luna seemed to sense the growing crisis. Her behavior became increasingly agitated as strangers returned to the area, reporters, lawyers, and investigators drawn by the new developments. The wolf began patrolling closer to Margaret's house, occasionally appearing in her backyard despite warnings from animal control. "She knows something's wrong," Dr. Sarah Beth Crawford observed during one of her visits. "Wolves are incredibly sensitive to stress and change in their pack members. Luna considers you and the babies part of her family unit now." The custody hearing was scheduled for the following week, but Margaret knew the outcome was predetermined. Jennifer Blake had superior financial resources, blood relation, and public sympathy for her brother's tragic deception. More importantly, she no longer seemed like the cold corporate attorney who had initially sought custody. Sterling's confession had revealed her as another victim of his manipulation. "I want you to know," Jennifer told Margaret during a private meeting, "that I don't blame you for fighting for Charlotte and William. You've given them love and care when they needed it most. But they're my family, Ms. Whitman. They're all I have left of my brother." Margaret nodded, understanding the inevitability of losing the children she had come to love as her own. But there was one aspect of their care that concerned her deeply: Jennifer's plan to return to Los Angeles, taking Charlotte and William hundreds of miles away from Luna. "They have a bond with that wolf," Margaret explained desperately. "I know it sounds impossible, but their health and emotional development are tied to maintaining some kind of contact with her. You saw how Charlotte's illness resolved when she was near Luna. Taking them away completely could cause real psychological damage." Jennifer's expression softened slightly. "Ms. Whitman, I appreciate your concern, but I can't base my children's future on superstition about animal bonding. They need stability, education, and a normal life. That means leaving this circus behind and starting fresh in California." The night before the custody hearing, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She bundled Charlotte and William in warm blankets and drove to Luna's territory for what she believed would be their final meeting. The wolf appeared quickly, as if she had been expecting them. What happened during that final encounter would become legend in Riverside Falls. Margaret placed both babies on a blanket within Luna's reach, and the wolf approached with extraordinary gentleness. She nuzzled each infant, her amber eyes seeming to memorize their faces. Then, in a display of intelligence that defied scientific explanation, Luna began what could only be described as a farewell ritual. She brought gifts: a perfectly shaped river stone for Charlotte, a small piece of driftwood for William. She groomed them carefully, cleaning their faces and hands with the same attention she would give her own pups. Finally, she lay down beside them and began a low, rhythmic humming sound that seemed to calm both babies into the deepest sleep they had experienced in weeks. Margaret watched through tears as Luna said goodbye to the children she had saved, the family she had never been allowed to fully claim. When the wolf finally stepped back and howled once into the night sky, it sounded like both a blessing and a lament, a mother's prayer for children she would never see again. The custody hearing the next morning was a formality. Judge Winters awarded full custody to Jennifer Blake, citing blood relation and the children's right to a stable, traditional family environment. Margaret was granted supervised visitation rights 1 weekend per month, but Jennifer made it clear that she would be moving to Los Angeles within the week. As Margaret watched Jennifer walk out of the courthouse carrying Charlotte and William, she felt a part of herself die. The babies who had given her life meaning again were gone, returning to a family that shared their blood but not their extraordinary history. Luna's howl echoed across the valley that night, a sound so mournful that even skeptics in town felt their hearts break. The wolf who had defied nature to save 2 human babies now faced the ultimate loss, watching her chosen family disappear forever, taken by laws and customs she could never understand. Margaret sat on her porch listening to Luna's cries, knowing that tomorrow she would begin the process of rebuilding a life that suddenly felt empty and purposeless once again. The miracle that had brought them all together was ending not in triumph, but in the quiet tragedy of good intentions overwhelmed by legal reality. 3 months had passed since Jennifer Blake took Charlotte and William to Los Angeles, and the silence in Riverside Falls felt deafening. Margaret Rose Whitman sat in her empty house, surrounded by baby clothes she couldn't bring herself to pack away and toys that would never again echo with children's laughter. The court-mandated monthly visits had been scheduled but never materialized. Jennifer's lawyers had filed injunctions citing the children's need for stability and freedom from traumatic associations. Luna's behavior had become increasingly erratic since the twins' departure. The wolf had lost significant weight, refusing to hunt properly and spending most of her time at the exact spot where Margaret had brought Charlotte and William for their final goodbye. Sarah Beth Crawford's research notes documented behavior that challenged every understanding of animal grief. Luna appeared to be mourning in a way that suggested deep emotional attachment rather than simple pack instinct. "She's dying of a broken heart," Sarah told Margaret during one of her increasingly frequent visits. "I've never seen anything like it in 30 years of wildlife research. She's not eating, not socializing with other wolves, not engaging in any normal behavioral patterns. It's as if she's decided life isn't worth living without them." Margaret understood the feeling intimately. Her own grief had returned with a vengeance, compounded by the knowledge that somewhere in California, Charlotte and William might be suffering the same inexplicable longing for the wolf who had first saved them. The monthly psychological evaluations continued, documenting her struggle with depression and what Dr. Reynolds termed complicated grief patterns. The phone call that changed everything came on a rainy Thursday morning in November. Jennifer Blake's voice was strained and desperate, lacking the confident authority that had characterized their previous interactions. "Miss Whitman, I need your help. Something's wrong with Charlotte and William, and the doctors here can't figure out what it is." Margaret's heart lurched. "What kind of wrong?" "They won't eat properly, they barely sleep, and they cry constantly. It's not colic or any medical condition the pediatricians can identify. They've lost weight, and their development has stalled completely. The doctors are talking about hospitalization for failure to thrive, but nothing they've tried has helped." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of heartbreak and vindication. "How long has this been going on?" "Since we got to Los Angeles," Jennifer admitted. "At first I thought it was just adjustment to a new environment, but it's getting worse instead of better. Last night, Charlotte stopped crying only when I played a nature documentary with wolf sounds. That's when I knew I had to call you." The desperation in Jennifer's voice was unmistakable. The confident attorney who had fought so hard for custody was now facing the reality that legal victory didn't guarantee emotional success. Her brother's children were failing under her care, and she had nowhere else to turn. "I think they need to come home," Jennifer continued, her voice breaking. "Not to me, to you, and to Luna. I don't understand it, and I don't like admitting it. But I think those babies have a bond that I can't replace or replicate." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. "What are you saying, Jennifer?" "I'm saying I want to transfer custody back to you. I'll hire the best lawyers, fight the state if I have to, but these children need whatever it is you and that wolf provided for them. My pride isn't worth watching them waste away." The legal process to reverse custody was unprecedented and extraordinarily complex. Jennifer Blake's attorneys had to argue that their own previous case had been flawed, that blood relation alone couldn't override the psychological bonds that had formed during the children's most vulnerable period. The media attention was intense, with experts debating whether children could form meaningful attachments to wild animals, and whether such bonds should be honored by the legal system. Dr. Amanda Chen provided crucial medical testimony about the twins' declining condition in Los Angeles. "These children show clear signs of psychological distress that began immediately upon separation from their previous environment," she explained to the court. "Their failure to thrive in a loving, well-resourced home suggests that we're dealing with attachment patterns that transcend traditional understanding of child development. But the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Blake had begun recording Charlotte and William's daily routines, hoping to identify patterns that might help her care for them better. The recording showed babies who were listless and unresponsive most of the time, but who became alert and engaged whenever they heard sounds that resembled wolf vocalizations, whether from nature documentaries, audio recordings, or even certain types of music with similar tonal qualities. "Your Honor," Jennifer testified, "I love these children with all my heart, and I wanted desperately to give them the normal, stable life I thought they deserved. But watching them deteriorate in my care has taught me that sometimes love means accepting that you're not what someone needs, even when you want to be." The custody reversal hearing took place on a cold December morning, with Luna visible on the distant hillside, as if she somehow understood the significance of the proceedings. Margaret sat in the same courtroom where she had fought for the children months earlier, but this time she was fighting alongside Jennifer rather than against her. Judge Winters, who had been following the case closely, addressed the unprecedented situation with characteristic gravity. "This court has been asked to consider whether psychological and emotional bonds formed during trauma can supersede traditional considerations of family placement. The evidence suggests that Charlotte and William Blake have formed attachments that are crucial to their well-being, regardless of how unusual those attachments might appear." The judge's ruling was carefully worded but decisive. Custody would be transferred back to Margaret Rose Whitman, with Jennifer Blake retaining significant visitation rights and involvement in major decisions about the children's future. Most importantly, the court acknowledged that contact with Luna, under appropriate supervision, was to be considered a medical necessity rather than an optional arrangement. These children survived an unthinkable tragedy because of bonds that science cannot fully explain, Judge Winters concluded. This court will not be responsible for severing those bonds a second time. The reunion at the courthouse was emotional beyond words. Margaret held Charlotte and William for the first time in 3 months, feeling their tiny bodies relax against hers as if they had finally come home. But the most extraordinary moment came when they drove back to Riverside Falls and Luna appeared on the road leading to Margaret's house. The wolf approached the car slowly, as if afraid to believe what she was seeing. When Margaret opened the car door and lifted the babies where Luna could see them, the wolf's reaction was unlike anything any of the observers had ever witnessed. She began what could only be described as a dance of joy, spinning in circles, play-bowing, and making soft, whimpering sounds that seemed to express pure happiness. Charlotte and William, who had been unresponsive and lethargic during their time in Los Angeles, immediately became alert and engaged. They reached toward Luna with obvious recognition, making soft cooing sounds that seemed to answer her calls. The medical staff who had accompanied them from California watched in amazement as the children who had been failing to thrive suddenly displayed normal infant responsiveness. Dr. Sarah Beth Crawford documented the reunion with scientific precision, noting the immediate physiological changes in both the children and Luna. Within hours of being reunited, the twins' stress indicators normalized completely, she reported. Luna's behavior shifted from depression-like symptoms to normal pack activity patterns. "We're witnessing a bond that challenges every assumption about interspecies relationships." Jennifer Blake stayed in Riverside Falls for 2 weeks, observing the children's transformation and gradually accepting that her best intentions hadn't been enough to meet their needs. She watched Margaret and Luna work together to care for Charlotte and William, Margaret providing human nurturing and protection, Luna offering a kind of security and comfort that no human could replicate. "I used to think this was all nonsense," Jennifer told Margaret on her final evening in town. "But watching them together, seeing how they respond to Luna's presence, I have to accept that love takes forms I never imagined possible." The arrangement they established was unusual but effective. Jennifer would visit monthly, maintaining her role as the children's aunt and legal advocate. Margaret would be their primary caregiver, providing the stability and understanding they needed. And Luna would continue her role as their protector and companion, offering something that neither human could provide alone. As spring returned to Riverside Falls, the house that had been silent for months again filled with the sounds of children growing and learning. Charlotte and William thrived under the combined care of their chosen human mother and their wolf guardian, developing into healthy, happy babies who seemed to understand from their earliest days that family could take many forms. Margaret would often sit on her porch in the evenings, watching Luna play gently with the children in the secure yard they had constructed. The wolf, who had once been willing to die for two human babies, had become their permanent guardian, proving that love truly knows no boundaries when it comes to protecting those who need care. The story of Luna, Margaret, and the Blake twins became a symbol of hope for people around the world. Proof that even in the darkest circumstances, love could triumph over convention, and that family was defined not by genetics or law, but by the willingness to sacrifice everything for those who matter most. 5 years later, Margaret Rose Whitman stood in her kitchen preparing birthday cake for Charlotte and William's 6th birthday party, watching through the window as the twins played in their backyard under Luna's watchful amber eyes. The wolf, now 9 years old and graying around her muzzle, moved more slowly than she once had, but her devotion to the children remained as fierce as ever. She lay in the shade of an old oak tree, alert to every sound and movement as Charlotte built sandcastles, while William attempted to teach Luna a new trick involving sitting and staying, a command the wolf had never needed since she naturally positioned herself wherever the children could be best protected. The transformation in all their lives had been remarkable. Margaret had found purpose again in ways she never thought possible, her grief over Emily's death evolving into gratitude for the unexpected second chance at motherhood. The empty house that had echoed with loneliness now rang with laughter, bedtime stories, and the comfortable chaos of family life. Charlotte had inherited her biological mother Rebecca's artistic temperament, spending hours drawing pictures of wolves and families that she proudly displayed on the refrigerator. William showed signs of his father Tommy's analytical mind, constantly asking questions about how things worked and why Luna behaved the way she did. Dr. Sarah Beth Crawford had documented their unique family arrangement in what became groundbreaking research about interspecies bonding and childhood development. Her published papers challenged decades of assumptions about animal consciousness and the therapeutic benefits of human-animal relationships. The Luna Foundation, established with donations from around the world, now supported similar research projects and provided funding for wildlife rehabilitation programs that emphasize the emotional intelligence of animals. Children who grow up with deep animal bonds show increased empathy, emotional stability, and social awareness, Sarah had written in her most recent paper. Charlotte and William Blake represent a new understanding of how love transcends species boundaries and contributes to healthy psychological development. Luna's role in the children's daily lives had evolved naturally over the years. She accompanied them on supervised walks through the surrounding wilderness, teaching them to move quietly through nature and observe wildlife without disturbing it. She seemed to understand which games were safe and which required intervention, gently nudging Charlotte away from steep drops, or placing herself between William and unfamiliar dogs at the local park. Most remarkably, she had learned to differentiate between normal childhood crying and distress that required immediate attention, often alerting Margaret to problems before human adults noticed them. The legal precedent established by their custody case had influenced family courts across the country. 3 other cases involving therapeutic animal relationships had cited the Blake decision, and several states had begun reconsidering their policies about wildlife contact in specific circumstances. Judge Patricia Winters, now retired, often spoke at legal conferences about the importance of considering unconventional family structures when they served children's best interests. Jennifer Blake remained an integral part of their extended family, visiting monthly and spending every summer vacation with the children in Colorado. Her initial skepticism about Luna had transformed into deep respect and even affection for the wolf who had succeeded where she had failed. She had never remarried, choosing instead to channel her nurturing instincts into being the best aunt possible to Charlotte and William. "I used to think love was about possession," Jennifer reflected during one visit, watching Luna teach William how to track animal prints in the mud beside the creek. "But Luna taught me that real love is about recognizing what someone needs and providing it, even when it means stepping back from what you want." The children's 6th birthday party was attended by most of Riverside Falls, a community that had initially been divided about wolf reintroduction but had gradually embraced the extraordinary family in their midst. Betty Morrison, the rancher who had once called for Luna's destruction, now brought homemade cookies and often asked Margaret for advice about dealing with wildlife on her property. "That wolf has done more for community relations than any government program ever could," Sheriff Bradley observed, watching Luna calmly supervise a group of children playing pin the tail on the donkey. "She's proved that coexistence isn't just possible, it's beneficial for everyone involved." Dr. Amanda Chen continued monitoring Charlotte and William's development, documenting health and emotional outcomes that exceeded every prediction. Both children scored above average on developmental assessments, showed unusually high levels of emotional intelligence, and demonstrated remarkable empathy for both humans and animals. They had never exhibited the behavioral problems often associated with early trauma, suggesting that Luna's care during their first critical days had provided a foundation of security that continued to benefit them. "Their attachment to Luna isn't pathological or limiting," Dr. Chen explained to visiting researchers. "It's actually enhanced their ability to form healthy relationships with humans. They understand loyalty, sacrifice, and unconditional love in ways that many adults struggle with." The most touching aspect of their family dynamic was the bedtime ritual that had evolved over the years. Each night, Margaret would read Charlotte and William a story while Luna lay beside their beds, occasionally contributing soft whimpers or gentle nuzzles at appropriate moments in the narrative. The children had learned to interpret Luna's subtle communications, understanding when she was content, concerned, or simply wanting attention. "Luna is our family guardian angel," Charlotte explained to a visiting journalist, her 6-year-old voice serious and confident. "She saved us when we were babies, and now she helps Mama Margaret take care of us every day." William nodded solemnly in agreement. "She's not just a pet, she's our sister. She knows when we're sad or scared, and she makes everything better." Margaret often marveled at how naturally the children accepted their unique situation. To them, having a wolf as a family member was simply normal. They couldn't imagine life without Luna's protective presence. They had learned about their dramatic rescue and Tommy's tragic mistake in age-appropriate ways, understanding that their birth father had been confused and hurt, but that their survival had brought them to exactly where they belonged. The approaching autumn marked another milestone. Charlotte and William would be starting first grade at Riverside Falls Elementary, where special accommodations had been made for Luna to accompany them during outdoor activities and lunch periods. The school board had initially resisted the arrangement, but Dr. Chen's research about the therapeutic benefits of Luna's presence had convinced them to try a pilot program. "These children have already overcome more trauma than most adults face in a lifetime," Principal Janet Morrison had argued to concerned parents. "If having their wolf companion nearby helps them feel secure enough to learn and grow, then we should support that arrangement." As the birthday celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Margaret found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment of simple domestic happiness. 5 years ago, she had been a broken woman living in isolation, convinced that her purpose in life had ended with Emily's death. Now, she was raising two remarkable children with the help of a wolf who had redefined everyone's understanding of love and loyalty. Luna seemed to sense Margaret's contemplative mood, approaching and gently leaning against her legs in the gesture of comfort that had become familiar over the years. The wolf's amber eyes looked up at Margaret with the same intelligence and affection that had first convinced her that this animal was more than just a predator following instinct. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, stroking Luna's graying fur. "For saving them, for saving me, for showing us all what family really means." As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, Charlotte and William helped clean up party decorations while Luna supervised from her favorite spot on the porch. The house that had once been filled with the silence of grief now echoed with the sounds of a family preparing for another day together. Homework discussions, bath time negotiations, and the comfortable routines of people who belong together. Margaret tucked the children into bed that night with the same sense of gratitude that had sustained her through the challenges of the past 5 years. Charlotte fell asleep clutching a stuffed wolf that looked remarkably like Luna, while William dreamed peacefully with his hand resting on Luna's warm flank where she lay beside his bed. The story that had begun with tragedy and desperation had evolved into something beautiful and enduring, proof that love could indeed conquer the boundaries between species, that families could be formed by choice rather than genetics, and that sometimes the most broken hearts create the strongest bonds. In a world that often seemed divided by fear and misunderstanding, the household where a woman, two children, and a wolf had learned to love each other unconditionally offered hope that connection and compassion could triumph over even the most impossible circumstances. To all the grandparents, empty nesters, and wise souls reading this, at our age, we understand that the most profound love often comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes life gives us a second chance to nurture and protect when we thought those days were behind us. Margaret found her purpose again at 55, proving it's never too late to build a family that fills your heart. Have you ever experienced an unexpected bond with a person or animal that changed your life when you needed it most? What would you do if life offered you a chance to love again in a completely different way than you ever imagined? Please share your stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear about the unexpected families and bonds that have brought meaning to your life.